Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. A few days ago I started a project. I made a gathered skirt. I filmed the pattern drafting for it, and then I also filmed the sewing. So I'm going to split it up into two different parts. In this video I'm drafting the waistband and the pocket, and in the next video I'll be sewing everything together. I did the drafting for the waistband, the curved waistband, and the pocket with a Pattern Master grading ruler, this small French curve ruler that looks almost like a hip curve, and then I also used a yardstick. So to get started making the curved waistband, you'll need a couple of measurements. So the first one is your waist circumference, which for me is 26.5 inches. And then you're also going to need to know how wide you want your waistband to be. Now for me, I decided that I wanted mine to be 2¼ inches wide. And then lastly, you're going to need to figure out, you're going to need to measure down from your natural waist from that 2¼ inches, whatever you decided you wanted your waistband width to be. And then you're going to want to measure your waistline at that point. And for me, that was 30 inches. And so basically, to make your waistband curved, you're going to want to slash and spread your, like a rectangle waistband, so that the bottom portion of the waistband is your lower waistline measurement. So in order to do that, I started off by drawing on my paper a rectangle the size of my waistline, and I added my seam allowance to that. So what I did was I took the 26.5 inches and then I added 1 inch to it. So I have a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on either side, and I made the width of this waistband to be the 2¼ inches, as I mentioned earlier. Now to spread my pattern, I took my waistline measurement without the seam allowance and I divided that by 4, and I got 6.62 inches, which is 6 5/8 of an inch. Now starting where my seam allowance ends, I take that 6 5/8 of an inch and I mark that 3 different times all the way across my waistband. Then I proceed to make lines, 3 different lines perpendicular to my waistband, and that is the 3 different spots that I'm going to slice my pattern open. And while I'm cutting my pattern open, it is now time to figure out how much we're going to spread our pattern by. So we're going to go back to the 30 inches, which is our lower waist measurement, and then you're going to subtract your waistline measurement. And so for me, that was 3.5 inches, and then you're going to want to quarter that. So we have 4 different sections for our waistband right now that we've sliced it open. And so we're going to divide the difference between our 2 waistline measurements by 4. And for me, I got 7/8 of an inch. And now I am spreading each kind of section of my pattern by that 7/8 of an inch, and I'm taping it down. And as you're doing this, you want to make sure you're careful with your paper so that it doesn't rip. Now, when you're doing the slashing, you want to slash it as close to the edge of your paper as possible. But doing that can also doing it will make your paper quite delicate, so you want to make sure while you're taping stuff down, it doesn't accidentally rip all the way through. And once I'm happy with how it's spread it out, and I've double checked to make sure that each section is spread properly by the right amount, I'm now going back to add more tape just to make sure that none of the paper will slide, because the next step is to trace out all of our pieces. And just so that I can get the bulk of my paper out of the way, I just kind of roughly cut out my pattern, and I'm going to trim down the rest later. And I will leave more paper than what you would expect to use, simply because I'm going to also add seam allowance to the top and the bottom of the waistband. So as you remember earlier, I never added any seam allowance to it. I want the width of my waistband to be 2¼ inches, and I made the current strip of paper 2¼ inches. So on top of that, I'm going to need to add a 1/2 inch to the top and the bottom. So to trace out my pattern, I first started off by tracing the 2 ends of the pattern piece. And then after that, I placed some tape on the ends just to secure it while I trace out the rest. And to trace it out, I used my grading ruler, but the grading ruler is more of a flimsy type of plastic. So you'll later see me switch to my yardstick ruler because it's just heavier and it doesn't slide as you try to trace things out. And also, I already have quite a few videos planned out, but if you guys have any video suggestions, just something that you guys would like to see soon, then please let me know. You can leave it in the comment section down below, or you can message me on Instagram. So now I have my pattern all traced out, and now I'm just removing all of the tape and the original piece of paper that I was working with. And what you're now left with is a very boxy shaped curved waistband. And so what you want to do is kind of curve out all those lines. So I'm using my pattern master to kind of smooth out all those lines. And then I ended up switching to my other ruler. I just found that the curve just seemed to work a little bit better, and I used this one to smooth out the boxy edges of both the top and the bottom of the waistband. And so that I don't forget that I already added a 1/2 inch of seam allowance on either side, I am just using my marker and my grading ruler to add that onto the pattern. And in a second, I'm going to begin to cut out my pattern. And halfway through cutting out the pattern is when I realized that I needed to add seam allowance to both the top and the bottom portion of the waistband. So while you guys are doing this, don't be so quick to cut your paper like I did. And remember that you have to add your seam allowance to the top and the bottom. And make sure when you're drafting your waistband that you don't add the seam allowance at the beginning, because you almost might be tempted to feel like I can skip a step, almost like how we already added the seam allowance to the ends of our pattern already. And you might feel like you can skip a step by adding the seam allowance in the beginning portion for that strip of paper, but the distance of, if you measure something that is curved, almost in a shape of a ray, and you measure the inner portion of it, and then you come down by say an inch, and then you measure that same curve, I guess it's almost like in track, why they always have the runners start at different spots, because the inner ring is, the distance of it is always shorter than the outer track ring. And so if you add your seam allowance at the very beginning, when you finally sew, you're going to find that the curve is going to become bigger. And so that's why you want to make the waistband curve, do your slashing, your spreading, and then add your seam allowance afterwards, so that when you sew it, you are now sewing on that line that you originally drew before. I know that was kind of a mouthful. I don't know if I explained that well, but that's basically the idea. But right now I am using my grading ruler again, and I'm adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the top and the bottom portion of my pattern, and I'm cutting it out once again. So after cutting out my waistband, I'm entirely finished with it, and I can move on to drafting the pocket. But I do want to say that for the waistband, you're going to need to cut 2, so I end up writing that down on my pattern piece later on. And because drafting a pocket is quite simple and this video is already getting kind of long, I'm going to go through this portion quite quickly. So to draft the pocket, I'm going to start off by drawing a rectangle that is 8¼ inches by 8½ inches. And then on the narrower side, the side that's 8 8/4 inches, I'm going to find the midway point, and I'm going to mark about a 4.5 to like 5-inch opening. You want this to be wide enough so that your hand can slide through. So whatever you feel you're comfortable with. I ended up on the pattern that you see here, I ended up making it 4 inches, but later on I changed it to 4.5 inches. But you can go as wide as like say 5 inches if you feel like your hand or whatever you plan on carrying around in your pocket will fit more comfortably with a larger opening. And then on the opposite side of the opening, I used the same curved ruler that I used earlier, and I used that ruler to kind of smooth out the edges so that it's not so sharp. And I just kind of trimmed away there was no like system to it. I probably cut off maybe about like 3/4 of an inch from the corners just so that it had like a nicer shape. And then I started marking my seam allowance within the pattern piece that I've already created. So on the top portion where the opening is going to be, I added a 1/2 inch, and I added a 1/2 inch all the way around the rest of the pattern, just kind of pivoting it around those curved areas so that I could get the lines kind of, in a smooth, fashion. And then I also kind of marked little small like perpendicular lines to the edge where the opening of the pocket is going to be. And that spot I'm going to mark notches onto my fabric later. That way I can just kind of keep track of where the opening for the pocket is going to be. So there's just 2 little notches at those points. And as I mentioned before, I ended up writing on my pattern pieces that you're going to need to cut 2 for the waistband, and then for the pocket you're going to need to cut 4 pieces. So each pocket is going to need a front and a back. And I cut my pockets out of a satin material, and then for the waistband I cut both pieces in my main fabric, and one of the pieces for the waistband I lined with a fusible interfacing. So as I mentioned earlier, my next video is going to be the sewing of this gathered skirt. So make sure you drafted all your pieces, you've gotten everything together, your interfacing, your zipper, and the video is going to go up on Sunday. So if you enjoyed the video, please comment, like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on all my social media accounts.